edition, 7th edition of Sned Talk. I'm Priscilla Wilson, and I'd like to tell you who the other members of the Adult Ed Committee are. I don't know where they are in here, but Tony Reed, Barbara Williams, and Ann Gillespie. And we all want to thank you guys so much for coming once again and supporting this program. You know, sometimes I think it's good to state the obvious, and so that's what I want to do for a minute. And that is that the fact that, first of all, the fact that we're even here pursuing education is such a luxury when you think about all the people in the world, you know, so that's something to be thankful for. But also, our presence here together is just an indication of some very important, deeply held values that we have. Obviously, the fact that we value education for its own sake. And I think we all share a feeling that learning is sacred and life-giving. So we thank you. And all of this inspiration and wonder are really thanks to our 3 speakers today. They've worked so hard to prepare really interesting talks for us, and we thank you so much. There's just no way to know how much work it is until you give a SNED talk. So we have, as usual, a bunch of people, other people we want to thank. Sam Williams, who designed our logo and is responsible for our program. Roger Williams, aka SawteeLive.com, our videographer. Janice Limburner, who shows up with plenty of $5 bills and plenty of smiles every time to take the money. Cindy and Mike Grace, who donated our podium last time. And Ron Bourne, who made a shelf to fit inside of it this time and is going to do another thing so that our sign will fit on the front of it. Let's see, Dee Dee Vogt, who coordinates our adult ed activities here at the center. Rick Rayfield, who puts that screen up and down, up and down again for us. It's a lot of work. We really appreciate Rick. Linda Harding, who does the lighting. Linda Harding, who does the sound. And Linda Harding, who makes it possible to have all these wonderful images which contribute so much to the talk. So thank you, Linda. And as always, we acknowledge our deep gratitude for the influence of the late Isabel Lumsden Couch. A few little housekeeping things. Please make sure your phones are on silent, and please don't take pictures during the talks. Our celebrities might, even though they're celebrities, they might be unnerved by that, you know. And restrooms, men's are that way at the end of that hall, and women's that way. The exit signs are here at my right and in the back of the auditorium. Most of you all know all the drill. So, as usual, the 3 speakers will talk for about 15 minutes each, and at the end you will have a chance to ask questions. So, without further ado, I'll introduce our first speaker. Many of you don't yet know Hildreth Davis because she and her husband Ron, who was the person thanked for the shelf in the podium, they live in North Hall County, but they have been SNED supporters, and they're definitely part of our community of shared values. Hildreth will wow you with her enthusiasm for weaving traditions in her talk, Weaving, the Warp and the Weft.
So, I'm a weaver, and I weave on this 4-shaft Dorset-style floor loom. Before learning to weave, I tried my hand at spinning on this drop spindle. This is perhaps the oldest spinning tool, and it's still used in many parts of the world today. Drop spindles have not changed much over the millennia. This is an Egyptian drop spindle from the late Bronze Age, from 1400 to 1000 before our Common Era. After many hours fooling with this and a lot of yarn of fibers, I came up with this really eclectic little wad of something like yarn, and you can see spinning wasn't going anywhere for me. So I learned to weave and finally became a weaver. Weaving is simply a technique to create some sort of cloth or fabric by combining two groups of threads or fibers, the warp or length and the weft that goes sideways across it. Then you tamp them down and you get cloth. The origins of weaving art and craft are lost in prehistory, with the exception of China, which has no creation myth at all, and the Judeo-Christian account, which does not address such things. Many indigenous cultures do include weaving and weaving arts in their creation myths and stories. For example, the Navajo legend relates that in the beginning, Spider Woman instructed the Navajo woman how to weave a loom. And the legend goes on to instruct the people to rub spider webs on the hands and arms of the little baby girls, so when she grew up, she would be able to weave and her fingers and arms would not grow weary from the weaving. The language of weaving is full of symbolism and sometimes magic. One Grimm's fairy tale tells about a poor girl and her magical spindle, shuttle, and needle. And of course, you know, it's magic, so she lived happily ever after. The words weft and woof both refer to the horizontal threads woven into the warp. Woof is just an archaic term. And we still have, however, the phrase warp and woof of life. It means the fabric of life, or the ups and downs of life. In China, the warp, being firmly fastened to the loom, symbolized the unchangeable forces of the natural world. And the weft, you know, it's woven in and out, back and forth, left and right, stood for the transient human affairs. In India, the long warp threads represent eternal existence, and the weft, the stages of a person's life. The English word heirloom derives from the practice of passing the valuable family loom down to the primary heir, a man, to be used mostly throughout the generations by the women. And this is an example of an heirloom that is located today at the Frontier Cultural Museum in Stanton, Virginia. This loom is from Ireland from the 1700s. In Ireland at that time, a younger son might be taught to be the weaver of the family, and he would weave until he grew up and a younger sibling could take his place. Now, for a child weaver, that was perhaps a coveted job. It kept him out from working outdoors in the cold and the rain or mucking out animal stalls all day, and he had a bed of his own in the weaving room. And being a weaver, you know, it was a big job. He worked all day, every day at that loom. And that sounds, even for a weaver like me, kind of tedious. But at a time when several children shared one small bed, imagine having a bed all to himself. No younger siblings peeing the bed next to him at night. That was a luxury. Producing the necessary cloth for a household was a lengthy task, beginning with the preparation of plant and animal fibers. There are many steps before spinning and finally weaving. This is flax, and here we have the fibers from the dried fibers from the flax plant, and these are the ready to spin and use flax to make linen. This is just raw wool, a bunch of it. And girls and women spent countless hours turning these raw materials into threads and yarns. The amount of thread and yarn needed to produce household linens for a family, for all their linens and their clothing, was staggering. And they produced them all by hand within the family homestead until the early 1800s, when ready-made fibers and cloth and yarns became available. The word spinster simply means an unmarried woman. Because girls spun and wove all the household linens, spinster came to mean an unmarried woman who just spun and wove and grew old, perhaps still in her 20s, without achieving a marriage partner and a home of her own. The word loom is Old English, it's jaloma, and it just simply means tool or utensil. From the archaeological record, we can reasonably be sure that plaiting baskets and mat making predate weaving and constituted preliminary steps toward making cloth. And here we have an Ojibwe weaving frame. It's just very simple. Two posts stuck deeply in the ground, and the warps are hanging down, and this is the weft, and it's kind of dangling down like that. And here we have an Ojibwe, Ojibwe are also called a Chippewa and Anishinaabe, and they're from up around Lake Superior. This is an Edward S. Curtis photo of a woman, and all these mats behind her were woven probably on a structure like the one we just saw on the last slide. This beautiful clay-caught girl has a cape around her head that is also woven on a primitive loom. This is a photograph called The Two Women, and they have baskets and woven blankets around their shoulders. And the basic patterns of basket weaving are the same we see in weaving. This is a little sampler. Down here is just plain weave or tabby weave, and these are some twills, and I don't know the name of that, but it's probably got a name. And when I talk about weaving, even though we weave baskets, when I talk about it, I mean binding fabrics on some kind of loom to make stuff like cloth. And here are a couple different looms. This is a typical West African loom from around the 1700s. It is reproduced at the Frontier Cultural Museum in Stanton, Virginia, and many enslaved Africans would have been very familiar with this type of loom. It's very simple. Again, the stakes deep in the ground. There's a beam here, and up here under this cloth there's another one, and the warp threads go around and around. And this is a drawing of a Navajo loom. And this is a Navajo loom in use. And look how big it is. Yeah, so she really needed those spider webs to keep her arms from getting tired. In the past, archaeologists didn't pay too much attention to textiles and weaving. They were looking for treasure. They wanted gold. And it's true that the fibers of plants and animals don't really hold up well out in nature. Of course, Egyptian mummies were always found swaths in textiles. This mummy has incredibly elaborate linen bindings. And a few of the mummified bog people found in the British Isles, Scandinavia, and Northern Europe, a few did have clothing, well-preserved clothing. This is the clothing of the Emir Scheidenveen man. He was found, or might be a man, but anyway, found at around 1200 BCE from that time, and found in a bog in the Netherlands. And the body was not well-preserved, but the clothing was here. This is actual cloth, and these are just little wooden implements that they found in the bog with him. Even with examples of ancient textiles like that one, we still don't get a lot of archaeological press for weaving. Why would that be? Well, Elizabeth Wayland Barber is an American archaeologist, linguist, and authority on prehistoric textiles, and this is one of her fascinating books on the subject. She writes that throughout most of history, the preparation of fibers, spinning, weaving fabric were women's work and mostly produced for immediate family use. Only at times when the textiles achieved economic importance outside the family hearth, in other words, when that cloth could be bartered or sold for monetary gain, did it become an occupation dominated by men. And the Industrial Revolution, with the advent of mechanized spinning machines, looms, and knitting machines, was just such a time. The Industrial Revolution took these crafts out of the home and into the factories. The workers were still primarily women and children, but the financial gain derived to the owners, and they were men. Weaving is a craft that developed in the more temperate climates. The fibers are scattered across Europe and Asia like this. We have hemp and flax here, cotton in India, silk in China, and this darkened area here is where wool would have been produced. The archaeological record reveals that both pottery and weaving of textiles in Europe began in the Neolithic age, the last part of the Stone Age, about 12,000 years ago. These skills and technologies developed independently and at later times historically in other cultures around the globe. Some of the earliest looms were warp-weighted. The loom was leaned against the wall, so imagine a wall right here, and the warp threads just dangled down here, and at the end they had little weights. The weights helped to keep those warp threads straight and somewhat untangled, dangling down like that. And that allowed the weaver to open the shed to change where the threads were for easier weaving. These loom weights were found in Denmark. They date from around the 4th or 5th century of our Common Era. The wooden loom was lost to fire or decay, but the row of stone weights went down and remained. Loom weights are made of different materials and come in different sizes. These are made of stone and pottery. They are found in Olynthus, Greece. They date from the Bronze Age. Again, the loom was lost, but the weights remained. You just might wonder, where do we find these loom weights? Well, we find them in archaeological digs like this one. And there they are, right there. This dwelling is from the early Bronze Age, around 2000 BCE, and there they are. And this, another early Bronze Age excavation, the loom weights are right here. And you can imagine, see, that's sort of the shape of the loom. Drawings and paintings of warp-weighted looms exist on pottery, on the walls of ancient tombs and houses, so we actually know what they look like. This is Circe's loom on a Greek vase from around 450 to 420 BCE, and we see the two little rows of loom weights. This is a Greek olive oil vessel from about 560 before our Common Era, and there you got it, warp weights. This warp-weighted loom, found in the Faroe Islands, is perhaps the oldest preserved loom from Scandinavia, and looms just like this one were still in common use in that area until the late 18th century. Here's an example of a chilkat weaving from the Pacific Northwest. The warp threads are simply bundled up together down here below the weaving work. Because those warp threads are floppy, they're kind of fuzzy, it is difficult to keep them untangled even when they're bundled up or weighted. So the development of a frame to hold the warp threads parallel and under tension was a really brilliant innovation. This is a horizontal ground loom from Cameroon, and you can see that the warps are stretched between these two beams. And here is a rigid heddle. Development of a rigid heddle was a huge technical advance for weaving. Prior to the development of a loom frame and heddles, weaving was more like darning it out as floppy thread. A rigid heddle made of wood, oftentimes, has two sets of openings, little holes and slots. And the warp is threaded through the holes and slots, one thread at a time. And by lifting that heddle, you expose a different set of threads, like that. That allows the weaver to pass the weft all the way across in one quick shot. It's easier, it's quicker, it reduces friction on all the fibers so they don't fray and break as easily. Now, since we live in North Georgia, you might wonder about historical examples of Cherokee weaving. And due to the damp and humid climate, the archaeological record is not just overflowing with examples, although some do exist. This is dogbane plant. It was a common plant broken to use as fibers for twisting and weaving. And this is dogbane ready to do that. This is the stalk of the plant, broken a little bit more, and you see the little twist going in there, and this is braided together to make cordage. The Cherokee and other tribes of the East Coast made cordage and rope and twines, which the early settlers described as superior and stronger to that which they brought with them. As far as we know, the Cherokee did not have looms, but they did produce narrow bands of stuff by a technique called finger weaving. The bands could then be joined together to produce larger pieces, and these bands were worked from fibers such as the dogbane and other native plants, and later they had European hemp and cotton. Now, thanks to the Padres accompanying the Spaniards on their push northward looking for gold, of course, We have copious written records of the Southwest tribes and their cultural activities, including weaving. Creation myths notwithstanding, we believe from the archaeological and historical record that the Navajo learned weaving from the Pueblo Indians. Prior to the Pueblo Revolt of 1680 to 1692, there is no record of Navajo weaving. They did not have cultivated cotton, they did not have looms, and they did not have sheep. Cotton, looms, and sheep arrived with the Pueblo peoples fleeing northward. Eventually, the Pueblo and Navajo peoples of the Southwest wove on both upright and horizontal or backstrap looms. And this is a Zuni woman weaving on a backstrap loom. The warps are hooked up here, and notice the rigid heddle. So, this is a Navajo weaver, picture also by Curtis, and what I like is this woman here on the left, she's using a drop spindle sort of like mine. To this day, the Navajo do weave with wool, and they create eye-popping designs like this one, and they really love red. So in conclusion, I would say that from the beginning until now and into the future, Spider-Woman is still working to preserve her craft. Thank you. Just water. So, any questions? Yes?
Where did you get your threads, and do you do any of your own dyeing?
No, I don't dye anything, and I mostly weave in recycled or repurposed fibers. So I tear up people's clothes, old sheets, anything. I do use some fibers that you could call yarn or thread if there's something hanging around. But I try not to purchase stuff if I can help it. Now my warp threads I do have to buy because they're long, and I buy those cotton from a company online. Any other questions?
Did you bring any samples of your work?
I did. They're in the reception room.
Okay.
Yes?
Is there a local weaving group here?
I don't know.
Yes, there is.
But there, see, someone else knew. There's a fabulous weaver up at Foxfire Museum, who at this very moment, her name escapes me, but yeah, she weaves and dyes her own yarn and everything.
How are the woody materials broken down to create the fiber?
So the indigenous peoples mashed them with rocks, just banged them, and the pioneers, and you can see it at the Stanton Frontier Cultural Museum in Stanton. I recommend you go, it's awesome. They had this gadget, and it's called a flax breaker, and it's long, it goes like this, and you lay the flax over it, and you bring the hammer down on it, wham! And then you just keep doing that until it's all broken up like that, and then you weave it. I can't even imagine. You saw what I wove, so no kidding.
I noticed you talked a lot about how the men got all the benefit of the women's work.
Yeah, and they got the financial
That's
gain.
not something we should revive again.
You go, team. You try that. I think it's still working that way in Bangladesh. Sorry. Anyway.
This time of year, I'm drowning in cat and dog hair. You know, they're shedding.
Yes.
And it has gone through my mind many more times than once. Gee, I could make a great one.
You could, and I have known people who spin that hair,
Really?
and then they knit that hair, and then when they wear the hat and it rains, they smell like a wet dog. They can't be done. I mean, for some reason, Angora rabbit doesn't smell as bad, but I don't.
You get it in blood.
Yeah, I mean, it is cool. I have known people, and it's an awesome cat. Where did you get that? Any more questions? No? Then I yield.
Next up is Stan Foster, who has lived here in Sawtee with his wife Dottie for 20 years. I don't want to embarrass Stan and Dottie, but I just need to say this aloud. These two people have likely done more good and made more friends in this wide world than anyone we will ever know. And many of you know them, and you know this to be true. Stan's talk is entitled Community Germination, Hope for the Future.
Good afternoon. 3 million children die of malnutrition each year. In poor, malnourished, underserved populations, government, private, and voluntary providers have insufficient vision and resources to ensure health and well-being at the community level. Communities have only one choice. They must own and control their own futures. They must identify the barriers to health and well-being, establish priorities, develop strategies, mobilize internal and external resources, and implement strategies. This afternoon, we're going to look at 4 countries: India, Ethiopia, Guatemala, and Mozambique. We're going to take examples from a community in each of these countries to share their progress toward well-being. Our first mentor is Dr. Abhay Bang, a pediatrician in a very poor area of India. 15 years ago, when Abhay was researching at Emory, he came up to visit us in Sati, and we were hiking up the Moccasin Trail to see the waterfalls. Along the way, I learned his correct connection to Gandhi, as shown as this picture of his living with his father in the Gandhi ashram. In many ways, 2 Gandhi quotes provide a foundation for understanding of communities. There are people in the world so hungry that God cannot appear to them except in the form of bread. Civilization, in the real sense of the term, consists not in the multiplication, but in the deliberate and voluntary reduction of wants. This alone promotes real happiness and contentment and increases the capacity of service. To Curtis Bang, Abhay's father, was a top economist in India. He traveled through India promoting liberation from Great Britain. It cost him 2 years in jail. De Curtis was awarded a U.S. University scholarship in economics. He asked Gandhi for his blessing. Gandhi, sitting on the long stool, and some of you have seen that picture, replied, "If you want to learn economics, move to the poorest village in India." De Curtis canceled his scholarship and moved to a very poor village. At age 95, a few years ago, he was still working to decrease the suicide rate in farmers. Abhay Bang and Rani Bang received their medical degrees in India and their public health degrees in the United States. When I used to introduce him to speak at Emory, I always said he went to some second-rate school in Baltimore, which was Johns Hopkins. Following their learnings from Gandhi and Takurta, Abhay and Rani located themselves in a very poor area called Gadchiroli. On arrival in Gadchiroli, Abhay identified sickle cell, a blood disease, in some of his patients. This at that time was an unknown problem. Abhay called the community representatives together and shared the problem. The communities responded, "This is not our problem, it is your problem." Based on the sickle cell experience, Abhay and Rani made the decision that future research would be limited to priorities identified by the people. When asked, communities identified 4 priority health problems: pneumonia, newborn deaths, malaria, and alcohol. Abhay's research confirmed pneumonia as a major killer of children. He also knew that pneumonia could be diagnosed by counting breaths in 1 minute. In rural areas where sick children had to be kept in homes, counting breaths had to take place in the home. Testing the ability of the smartest community women to count, Abhay found out that they could only count to 10. Abhay developed an abacus-like tool, which you see on the screen, where the breath counter moved over 1 ball every 10 breaths. If all balls were over by the egg timer's 1 minute, the child had pneumonia, was given an oral antibiotic, and recovered. When Abai researched the newborn death problem, he found out the midwives were only caring for the mothers. No one was taking care of the babies with airway obstruction, low temperature from traditional cold baths, and infection. Each community selected one woman. Staff were trained by Abai's team. The selected woman became known as barefoot neonatologists. They learned to clear airways, warm the baby in a sleeping bag, identify and treat. As we see on the slide here, we can see the change in mortality. Well, before they started treating pneumonia, it was 120 mortality. After a few years, it was down to 60. Once they started dealing with home-based newborn care, they got it down to 24. We now travel to our far region in Ethiopia, where 90% of young girls undergo genital cutting, with a subsequent severe pain with menstruation, intercourse, and delivery. You can see the tools used for it.
Living in one of the harshest places in the world, the Afar are one of the poorest ethnic groups in Ethiopia. 1 in 3 Afar children will die before the age of 5, and only 2% of the population can read and write. For centuries, the Afar have practiced female genital cutting. Girls are cut before the age of 12 in groups of 20, in a ceremony attended only by women. Although it's an important rite of passage in Afar culture, it often results in serious health problems and lasting emotional trauma. When Abai turned 8, her mother announced it was time for her ceremony. Much to everyone's surprise, Abai said no. Her mother insisted. An Afar woman who had not been cut would be considered unclean and could never marry. When her mother's demands became unbearable, Abai ran away to live with her godfather in Ethiopia's capital, Addis Ababa. Shortly after her 18th birthday and her graduation from school, Abai returned to her former village. Determined to help improve the health and education of her people, she applied for a job with CARE and asked to be stationed in Awash Fentali. Over the next 5 years working with CARE, Abai helped open a primary school and 3 health posts. She also oversaw the drilling of a well and began the community's first agricultural program.
Abai initiated dialogue among many things, first about schools, then about health, and finally about female genital cutting. The men felt that Abai was challenging the Afar culture and threatened her with a gun. Abai arranged the filming of female genital cutting, an event only known to women, and showed the film to the men. After 4 days of debate, the men voted 15-2 to stop the cutting. The man convened a community meeting. While traditionally all meetings were limited to men, both men and women were invited.
While being there with Abai, I witnessed another historic meeting. A meeting organized with CARE's help to elect the leaders of the Anti-Female Genital Cutting Association. Their agenda? To spread the message to the other Afar communities. Nearly 90 men and women packed the meeting hall. Women voiced their opinions, even challenging the men. At the end of the day, a woman was elected president of the association. Abai helped bridge a gap between Afar men and women that had existed for centuries.
Our next country is Guatemala, where the 17 million population, where 51% of the 17 million population are indigenous. 620,000 of these are Mam people who were exploited by the Spanish, forced into slavery, and pushed onto the mountains, sharp hills, and valleys. Our mentor here is Rosario, a nurse midwife and sociologist. As she studied poverty and malnutrition, she recognized that the only hope for development was the organization of women's groups at the community level. Over 25 years, the number of community women's groups increased from 0 to 30. Pictured here are the directors of the Mam Association of Christian Women for Development. This picture also includes my wife Dorothy, who grew up in Guatemala, is fluent in the Mam language, and has returned annually the last 20 years. Each year, a workshop is held to strengthen community ability to solve the problem that they identify. Last June, the woman asked help with malnutrition in Las Barrancas. Only 2 of the 70 children we examined had normal nutrition. Currently, a food supplementation program for 6 to 23-month-old children is being developed. Collectively, the women work together to identify and solve their problems, to weave, to connect with our previous presentation, sewing. Over 800 women have been trained in sewing, a 1-year course over the years, and the last is learning to read and write. What do the women choose to do? They grow corn, but they grow corn and beans and flava together. The beans and the flava put nitrogen back in the soil. They grow plants, they weed, they take care of animals. They also recently have got into the forestry business, growing seedlings, selling them to deal with the problem of deforestation. 500 locally produced water filters have been given to homes. The family pays $10 and U.S. partners match with $90. Safe water decreases diarrhea, improves child nutrition, and reduces child deaths. Health workers measure arm circumference and weigh children, measure lengths, and identify undernourished and improve feeding. Doctors and nurses diagnose and treat pregnant women and children. Drugs are obtained at low costs through MAP International in Brunswick, Georgia. Last year we got about $7,000 worth of drugs for $1,500. Our 4th country is Mozambique, located in the southeast corner of Africa. Our mentor here is Rebecca Vandermeulen, a student of mine at Emory from 2001 to 2003. As part of her study, she carried out a study of latrines in Mozambique. On graduation, she turned down a prestigious DC fellowship at a high income and returned to Mozambique. On arrival, Rebecca received the following request from the Anglican Church. Please listen to the request, because I'm going to ask each of you afterwards how you would do if you got that request. We have a large area with no roads. We have no health care. We have high rates of HIV/AIDS. We have 200 churches. And then they asked, Rebecca, will you help us? If each of you received those 4 requests, what would you have answered?
This is how I normally look. This is a few months ago, but this is working with a new health committee, a health committee that was formed to help be a link between the government health services and the communities. Every day is different. Here I am working with a mother who has a child who's just not growing well, and we were talking about ways that she could prepare better food for her child. And I was working with a new team of community activists, so sort of teaching them while I also taught the mother. I do a lot of coordination with community leaders, whoever they may be. In this case, it was a Shay in a Muslim community who is eager to work with us. This was a orphaned child who has been supported by this pig, and this pig is her treasure, and she cares for it daily, and it was an honor for me to be able to hold her pig as well. This is a road that I experienced 2 weeks ago that wasn't really a road, and the tractor that came to rescue us also realized it wasn't really a road. But to me, this shows the reason why we need community health workers, because we can't get to these places from the outside. The government that's not visiting, no one's visiting from the outside. So the only way that community health or healthcare can be provided is through people who are already living there, who will stay there. It's another advantage of working through the church, because often the church is in the middle of nowhere places where cars couldn't get, motorcycles couldn't get, but churches are there. And so working through the church to provide HIV service has allowed there to be a very deep reach. This was an archdeacon walking. He had to walk through this river to get to the cathedral. It's just part of life. So our field workers are regularly walking in places where even motorcycles or bicycles couldn't go. They do also travel quite a bit by bicycle.
but sometimes you need to put your bicycle in a canoe to continue the journey as well. And this is where community health workers can do it, and others are not doing it. This picture here shows William and Martine, who are indeed agents. They are just now about to set out on a 140-mile walk with backpacks full of antiretroviral medication and a Pima machine for measuring CD4 levels. They do that every month, and it was raining the day they left, but people are waiting, so rains do not stop their work. This is Gloria. Gloria is on staff. She had always wanted to do health work and had actually worked as a cleaner in a hospital during the Portuguese time, and has been incredibly dedicated and is now doing good HIV testing in her communities and inspiring many people who would be afraid otherwise to get an HIV test to get one. She gives herself an HIV test when there are enough tests available every time before she tests someone else to show them how easy it is. This is Joyce herself living with HIV, and Joyce is another one with an incredible spirit. Though living with HIV and actually struggling with HIV more than some do, she is also the community health curative care provider in her community. And in addition to sitting at the health post for 2 hours every morning, does an awful lot of home visits to people she knows need continued care. And people like Joyce keep me going. Rahema here on the left only went through grade 5 and is now one of our wonderful trainers of traditional birth attendants. There's good community education that happens as a result of those. Pamphlets given out, a lot of door-to-door teaching. That's something that's been very effective. People are afraid to ask questions in a big room. But if someone comes to your door and says, what are your questions about HIV? The questions come out. And there's really good conversations that happen. There's a lot of drama that's done and some preaching. We have quite a few priests who are also now actively teaching about HIV on a regular basis in church. And that helps also open up in terms of people who are living with HIV. It's a normal thing in church now. Not everywhere, but in many places. There's a lot of practical support done for people who are often widows or orphans, sometimes related to HIV issues, but not necessarily. Work with children, again, many of whom may be orphaned, but not exclusively. And teaching of practical skills. So this boy had lost his parents to HIV and lived with his grandmother and needed a new roof on his house. So the team came and taught him how to put a new roof on his house, the type of teaching a father would have given. And this man is named Domingos. He credits his son to having kept him alive. His wife had already died, and he was dying of AIDS. His son was the one at age 6 who was doing all he could to find food for his father. And then his son heard about the local Equipa da Vida, which I will tell you about in a minute, which is the community-based HIV team. And his son went and called them. They took him to get an HIV test. Now he's on treatment and encouraging all of his neighbors to get HIV tests as well. And he says, now I can be the father to my son, even though my son had to be my father for a while.
Over the last 2 to 3 years, in my emails to Rebecca, she said, the time is coming when I can leave and feel assured that the program will continue without me. 3 months ago, she actually left Mozambique, take a new job as the head of a program in New York, and has gone on. She departs after 15 years. She leaves behind, in the area where she was working, 320 communities with health AIDS units and 10,000 volunteers. And it's very interesting in that they are not all HIV units. They're really well-being units, which affect prevention, diagnosis and treatment of AIDS, and prevention and diagnosis of other things. As we come to a close, let us remember Abhay Bhan in India, developing a tool to count respirations and diagnose and treat pneumonia. Abhay in Ethiopia refusing at age 8 female genital cutting. 30 women's groups in Guatemala using small loans to improve well-being of their families and communities. And the 6-year-old boy in Mozambique that fed his father, arranged HIV testing and treatment, and again became his father's son. Thank you very much. Yes?
I wonder if you might tell about your next trip to Guatemala, and you might need a couple of volunteers.
My wife, we have 10 people going, and it's cheaper if we have 12. So if 2 of you want to volunteer, my wife will speak to you afterward. Each year, they do it. This year is going to be somewhat exciting. One of the things will be the dedication of a new unit where they've expanded the clinic and the midwifery and also put a floor together for the women to come and meet. And that will be dedicated in June. We will also hold 2 workshops, mostly for children and pregnant women. And then we'll also work with them on the development of the feeding program for Las Barrancas that we got into last year. Yes?
Dr. Foster, has the incidence of female mutilation, genital mutilation, decreased worldwide?
It's significantly coming down. As far as I know, the area that we looked at was the highest in the world. And the fact that this young girl started a movement in that area, things are beginning to move in that direction. And it actually requires women making a decision. Prior to this event where they had the meeting, women were not even allowed to go listen to the men at their meetings. This meeting where they had the women and the men come together, and I hope you noticed the women were sitting on one side and the men were on another, but they allowed the women to speak, and they actually elected a woman as the chair of the committee. So things like that are the right direction, and it's only as women take on the role that they do have some power and some decision that these things can happen. Yes?
How do you take donations and help folks other than those that can go to Guatemala? I mean, if somebody wanted to give you money, would you?
They give it to the Nacuchi Presbyterian Church for the Guatemala Fund, and the money will go there. And if you put in $90, somebody will get a water filter. Yes.
Thank you, Stan Foster, for the impact that you have had on all the young folks you have worked with all over the world.
Well, thanks for the thank you. The other side of that needs to be spoken of, because it's been a privilege to work with these people, and it's learning from these people. I have medical force officers that worked with me in Bangladesh that lost their lives doing the same work that I was doing. So it's been a privilege to work with these people and to learn from these people. And one learns from your mistakes. I'll give you one example. In Bangladesh, we had a reward for reporting a case of smallpox. About $5, big money in Bangladesh. And we had everything. We had banners, and we had radio programs, and we had posters on every back of every rickshaw. And only 30% of 60 million people knew about the reward. And we weren't finding the smallpox. We went out and looked, and what we found was the health workers weren't telling the public about the reward because they're afraid the public would claim the reward and they wouldn't get the money. So learning that mistake, we doubled the reward to pay both the health worker and the public, and within 3 months, 80% of 60 million people knew about the reward. Any other questions? Thank you very much.
Jonna Tuttle also lives in our Sati community and first became known to many of you when she was an interpretive ranger at Smithgall Woods. Jonna is really an exceptional environmentalist and, as she likes to put it, student of nature. If you read your program, she's already taught you one word. I have to look at it in my notes. Phenology. Jonna's talk is entitled Shifting Spring.
spring peepers. Some of you may have heard them as I have at Bean Creek lately. It was nearly 60 years ago when Rachel Carson brought the public's attention to the dangers of the pesticide DDT. Her book, Silent Spring, was largely responsible for banning this pesticide that was causing a rapid decline in the bald eagle population. Here's a quote from Ms. Carson's book. "Those who contemplate the beauty of the earth find reserves of strength that will endure as long as life lasts. There is something infinitely healing in the repeated refrains of nature, the assurance that dawn comes after night and spring after winter." In our area, some of those repeated refrains are wildflowers that we anticipate each spring. Here, trailing arbutus, one of the important wildflowers in our mountain culture. This one was collected into tiny bouquets for mothers to acknowledge the beginning of spring. And the blooming of this tree coincided with the beginning of a season of travel for circuit riding preachers. They'd conduct services such as weddings and baptisms, thus the common name serviceberry. Some of you may know it also as sarvisberry or shadbush. In 2017, local weather and nature observer Bill Kinsland noted that bloom dates for these fell between March 4th and 8th, some of the earliest native flowers of the year. Some people, like Bill Kinsland, keep journals of their observations. Bill has observed bloom times for more than 36 plants in White and Lumpkin County over the past 30 years. Here I've graphed Bill's observations of mountain laurel bloom times. As is the norm, bloom dates vary from year to year. But when enough data is available, you begin to see trends or patterns. The lower the line on the graph here means the earlier in the year the bloom time occurred. Note the bloom time in the early section here falls around this day 30, but then in the last 10 years you see this what is a trend coming into bloom earlier, and this is a good over a week earlier since 2009. So it turns out that spring indicators across the globe are demonstrating a significant shift toward an earlier spring. So when spring begins is changing. That's the trend that's being demonstrated by temperature, plant emergence, bloom times. There's also a trend toward a later fall, which means that you've got a longer warm season, a longer growing season. Humans have been making calendars of all sorts to monitor plant emergence and bloom times for thousands of years. Each observation in itself is interesting, but it doesn't give you much to use if you want to predict something like planting time for next year. For that, you've got to have years of observations that illuminate these trends to provide the opportunity to predict and make informed decisions. So this practice of observing appearances of natural events was coined phenology in the 1800s, which is the study of cyclic and seasonal natural phenomena, especially in relation to climate and plant and animal life. Now for a brief history of phenology. Nature observations may have first occurred in primitive farming societies. Places like Egypt and China have left signs of cyclical observations made thousands of years ago. These observations helped predict dates for planting and harvest in the year to come. From my own history in the area, I don't plant corn before May 15th. It just so happens that the observations that led to this Native American maxim still seem to apply. Plant corn when oak leaves are the size of squirrels' ears. How's that for observation skills? Observations have also been made for religious and cultural purposes, such as cherry tree bloom time in Japan. The cherry blossoms are the national flower of Japan and symbolize the beauty and brevity of life. Because of their significance, bloom dates have been recorded in Japan for a really long time. This chart has peak bloom dates back to the year 800. Notice that peak bloom dates do vary over time. What's most curious, though, is the change that takes place in the last 100 to 150 years, but especially since 1970. So again, you know, you're going on and on and on, and then there's this shift. So a change in peak bloom time, which came on April 18th in 1829, shifting to April 7th since 1970, a trend. Henry David Thoreau kept a daily journal from 1851 to 1858 for close to 500 plant species around Walden Pond. Naturalists continued to observe plants around Walden until 1993. So that gives us 142 years to see trends emerge, like the shift in bloom time for blueberries to 3 weeks earlier. So people have been making observations of cyclical events in nature for a long time for a lot of reasons. But as a science, this practice really took off in the 1700s with the work of two men, Swedish naturalist Carl Linnaeus, whose name you might recall from biology class. He's known for his system of classifying flora and fauna. And the other was Robert Marsham, a wealthy British landowner and naturalist who kept detailed accounts of plants, birds, and climate for 60 years on his estate. What Linnaeus and Marsham did was to make observations of cyclical natural events, but in a very ordered and consistent way. Their data included events throughout the year: leaf emergence, flowering, fruiting, leaf fall. Marsham layered that information with observations on how climate affected these events: temperature, wind, soil moisture, as well as the location of the plant. Scientists who followed them developed models in specific areas, for example, demonstrating relationships between winter temperatures and spring emergence. Today, phenology is a sophisticated science primarily directed toward the study of climate change. The better we understand changing cycles, the better we can mitigate their impact. Like, can we make more Pinot Noir this year? There's a lot of research on how temperature and climate affect vines, some of that data dating back to 1370. So as sophisticated as this science is today, it still relies on simple observations of natural events. All over the planet, citizen scientists are making observations that help phenology experts better understand shifting cycles in nature. We did this at Smithcall Woods when I was a naturalist there. Volunteers went out once a week to check marked plants and noted things like leaf emergence, leaf expansion, flowering, fruiting, leaf drop. It's a routine that creates a very intimate connection to the woods and the life that's there. Not just walking by and noting a flash of color on a bloom, but seeing the whole life cycle of a single plant, such as these stages of mayapple. Phenology experts also study animal cycles, such as migration. Have you noticed waves of robins in spring? Robins in our area tend to stay year-round, but there are also migrating robins that fly south to Gulf states from the north each winter as their food supply becomes limited. They begin migrating back north in late winter, early spring, when day length increases, and they appear in large groups that are referred to as waves. I would see sometimes 50, 100, 200 robins at a time in the field at Smithcall Woods. It might not seem very impressive, but earthworms also migrate. Granted, it may be just a few feet, but they do move down into the soil as temperatures drop and then migrate vertically back to the soil surface as the ground thaws with rising temperatures. And it just so happens that this migration coincides with robin migration. Another spectacular migration is that of the monarch butterfly. They travel en masse up to 3,000 miles each year to overwintering sites in Mexico, and they've been doing that for thousands of years. They tend to migrate through our area in May when females lay eggs, and then again in September when they're migrating south. One of the issues of interest in phenology is the mismatch that's developing between species that rely on each other. Monarchs are dependent on one group of plants, milkweeds. In our area, these are some of the showy milkweeds that they utilize. Monarch numbers have reduced dramatically in recent years. There's speculation that part of the reason is a reduced food supply. So what if monarchs get to Georgia and the flowers are not available to supply the nectar for their journey? That's an example of a mismatch cycle. Do salamanders migrate? Why, yes, they do. Related to mating rituals. These amphibians are living in our woodlands, but we rarely see them because they're burrowing under leaf litter and they're also nocturnal. So they only usually emerge at night. But like lonely humans lining up at the local bar, mating season gets them out. They return faithfully each year to ponds that temporarily fill with rain. They mate and lay eggs around October. But what happens if it doesn't rain? No rain, no hatch. This invasive species has pretty much expanded throughout the U.S. I can tell some of you recognize this insect. They pretty much expanded throughout the U.S. in a short 20 years. They can produce one generation a year anywhere in the U.S. The problem is, with a longer warm season due to a change in climate, they can produce up to 6 generations a year in a warm state like Georgia. At 400 eggs per female, you do the math. So in addition to scarring my perfect heirloom tomatoes with their piercing mouthparts, they also do a lot of damage to blueberry and cotton crops, and the larval form produce this cat face on peaches, which obviously has an impact on peach production. So, is all of this good or bad? Well, little Jimmy, it's complicated. What we do know is that a longer growing season does impact humans and the rest of the natural world. A longer growing season might mean more tourist dollars, and it might mean more mayfly hatches for you fishermen. But it also may mean that we don't have as many perfect peaches. It means conditions are right for more insect pests, affecting forests and food supply, and requiring more pesticides. It results in mismatched cycles among dependent species, longer allergen cycles, and drier soils, potentially leading to wildfires. Whole ecosystems can be affected as the base of the food chain, insects and plants, are affected. That's where the value of the science of phenology comes in. Observations of natural cycles lead us to recognition of trends, which lead to a recognition of issues, which supports decision-making to mitigate those issues. Rachel Carson used her writing to help people understand that humans are not separate from the environment. A longer reproductive season for mosquitoes on the surface might not seem connected to humans, but what if they carry the Zika virus? Counting insects might seem quaint, but what if these insects are pollinators that support our food supply? These environmental issues are human issues. Phenology helps us identify and mitigate issues resulting from changing natural cycles. It offers us a way to connect the dots and see that we are not separate from the rest of nature. And it can actually be fun. You can learn things about your backyard or neighborhood that you never knew. I'd like to propose that we have a phenology project at SNCA. We can work as a team of citizen scientists, to keep data on these plants for science and for posterity. And these are some of the groups that are doing phenology projects that are potentially places that you can go to pursue your own studies, taking observations and reporting them to these organizations. And I'll take a few questions if you have them. Yes.
Are you going to have a sign-up sheet for people who are interested in this SNCA project in case we get it off the ground?
Absolutely. In the reception area, I'll have something that you can put your name and contact information on. Thank you. Yes.
I'm really interested in, as well as the Earth getting warmer and having a longer span of growth, how many things are blooming at different times. Like, I have in my yard January honeysuckle that's now full bloom. The Calaboris that usually blooms around Christmas just in the last few weeks has bloomed. And the camellias that oftentimes bloom in November, December have been at their peak this last month.
So I'm sure there's a lot more that someone could say about that, but we do know that they're responding to a couple of things for sure. One is temperature, and the other is length of day. So as those are changing, they're just doing what they normally do, but if those factors are different, then what they normally do is going to be at different times, if that makes any sense. There may be someone else that could say even more about that.
It just makes me appreciate how mixed up everything is.
Yeah.
Which we know, and then the correlation of the impact on us people as well.
Right. And I will point out that one of the important things about phenology is that, we do see these shifts. If Bill Kinsland were here, because he keeps up so well with the weather data for us, he could tell you off the top of his head that in the last 5 or 10 years, we've had the warmest, the coldest, the wettest. And all of that is very curious. Again, it's the trends that make the difference. But one of the things that brings to mind, Elizabeth, is this quote that I found really interesting from an Alaskan Native woman. It's actually a quote about her. "The seasons are getting very fast and are all mixed up. The last few years my grandmother was living, she said that there was not enough time to put things away like there used to be. When we are done with the willow leaves, then come the sourdocks. These seasons are in too much of a hurry now." Hannah Miller in Nome, Alaska. So, somebody that spent a lifetime collecting these plants for medicine, recognizing that shift across the period of her life, which is sometimes hard to see, and that's where the data comes in handy, because we can use that, particularly these data sets that are so broad-reaching, over hundreds of years, that really tell the tale. Yes, ma'am.
I think one of the concerns that seems, was there somebody else with their hand up?
You go ahead.
Okay. Was the speed at which this is moving, because you talked about the mismatching that's occurring, and presumably these interdependencies for migrating animals and with the plants and the other animals wherever they go, have developed over time, over long periods of time. And now we're looking at something that's happening very quickly, these changes. And so, therefore, the risk is that they might not be able to adapt in time. And then we're looking at potentially large numbers of species disappearing because of it, because there isn't the time to adjust to changes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which is a big worry.
And for lots of different reasons, this is just one. You know, the loss of habitat is certainly one of the biggest problems that we face right now. But you're absolutely right. I mean, the decline in the number of species just in the past 100 years is pretty shocking.
I guess I just wanted to hear something hopeful in terms of, through the study of phenology, what are some thoughts or ideas, do you know, as to make the patterns match? I mean, what can be done?
So I think I have to say that one of the things is that we have to be willing to use the science. And we have to be able to say we're going to look at the data that's available to us and agree that there are things like carbon dioxide that are and greenhouse gases that are issues that we have to address as a planet. So that's one thing. But there are, on a smaller scale, there's certainly things that we can do if we find that there are pests that are multiplying like the stink bugs. Then the more we're aware of when they're available to damage the plants, then we can put in place management to defeat them, so to speak. The same could be true for mosquitoes. You know, if we know that that's an issue and that the longer period is producing more generations, then we can create programs that address that earlier on in the year.
It's very big.
It is very big, yeah. But I don't want to minimize either the whole benefit of being citizen scientists. I mean, just imagine people all over the planet taking data, how much that improves our ability to address situations. And I'm sure you've seen this. I mean, you know, in the different microclimates in our area, or as you drive from region to region, you know, you can see these changes happening. And so if you have more data from all of these areas, it improves what scientists can do with that information. So sign up. Or if you don't want to sign up, put it in your house.
I'd like to point out, make sure everybody knows that the information is in your program. Those online, those websites and things that will permit you to get involved as a citizen scientist. So be sure and take your programs with you. We like to, at this point, I'll try to make it fast because we have lots of good refreshments next door. But we'd like to recognize our past speakers who are here. And I've noticed some, and you can tell me who I'm missing. Robin Chandler Wilkes is here from our very first guinea pig group. Let's see, Ann and Henry Tipton are here. Linda Crittenden's here. Let's see, Linda Dahl, I saw Ted, I didn't see Linda.
Linda couldn't make it.
Oh, okay, Ted Dahl is here. Jim Smoot's here. And anybody I missed? Well, we think it's a really neat indicator that the people who've been speakers want to come back. So thank you all. And just quickly, I want to I've been instructed to make a bigger pitch than usual for speakers. because our reserves are getting low. And I know there are people sitting here who feel drawn to do this. You need a new challenge in your life, you know. And here's the thing, though. And I've had one-to-one conversations with people, and people always say, "Well, I'm not an expert on anything." You don't have to be. You just have to pick out something you want to learn about. A perfect example that came to my mind this morning is Maria Mitchell. You know who she is? First female astronomer. And, well, there's worlds of information. Anyway, I'm sorry. Just talk to me or any of the committee members. We'll help you get a topic. You don't have to have a topic, just simply to say to one of us, "I'm interested." And also, I want to make it a little pitch for you to sign up for our email list. If you did not receive reminders, there's a spiral notebook out on the desk, so please sign up for that. And anything else? All right, well, please eat up. We need you to eat this food next door.
I have a friend today, she did it for the first time.
How are you? How are you? Good to see you. Surprise. Yeah, right.